Chapter 10. More willfulness on the part of the heiress. Private theatricals. Failure of a young performer and its consequences. Philosophical breakfast table. A morning's excursion. No sooner did Miss Brotherton enter the room where she had left her old friend, who was still tranquilly enjoying the perfumed air which visited her through the open window as she sat knitting before it, than, throwing her bonnet to the one side, she began to examine and cross-examine her as follows. "Pray, Miss Tremlett, do you know anything about the factory people that work in all these great ugly buildings round about Ashley?" Miss Tremlett looked up at her for a moment before she replied, then said, "I know very little about them, Miss Mary. I do not know more than you do, I believe." "I have just been thinking, Miss Tremlett, how exceedingly wrong it is that I should be so profoundly ignorant on the subject." "Wrong? I don't see anything wrong, my dear, in your not knowing what you was never told." "I have been wrong in never wishing to be told, but in truth I have never thought upon the subject, and I have been very wrong in this. That silly body, Lady Clarissa, said a few words today which, quite unlike the usual effect of what she utters, made a great impression upon me. Speaking of the children who work in these factories, Nurse Tremlett, she said theirs was a very different way of life than that of the children whose parents, from father to son, have worked for a dozen generations on the lands of the same family. There cannot be the same sort of family feeling and attachment, she said. But why should there not, Miss Tremlett? These people work on, I dare say, from generation to generation, and yet, God help them, poor souls, from the hour of my birth to the present day, I never heard anybody talk of attachment to them. Can you explain this difference to me? I do not at all understand it, but I am quite certain it cannot be right. Why, why do why do we not know something about our poor people as the people with landed estates know about theirs?" "Upon my word, my dear, you have asked me a question not over and above easy to answer. That is to say, as it being right. But it is easy enough, too, in another way, for I must say plain and straight, without any fear of blundering, that the thing is impossible." "What thing is impossible, Miss Tremlett?" "Why, that factory people should be noticed by the gentlefolk, and treated in the same way as labourers that work the land." "You are too wise a woman, Miss Tremlett," replied Mary, "to assert so positively what you did not know to be true. Therefore I will take it for granted that it is impossible for people working in a factory to be treated in the same way as people working on a farm. And now, seeing, God help me, that I am most frightfully ignorant, I must beg you to tell me what is the cause of this extraordinary dissimilarity between the different classes of the labouring poor." "My dear child, it would hardly be decent to enter into all the reasons. Country folk, that is, field labourers, I mean, are just as likely to be good and virtuous as their betters, and so they are for everything that I have ever seen to the contrary. But it is altogether a different thing with the factory people. By what I can hear, for, of course, I have never went among them, they are about the worst set of creatures that burden God's earth. The men are vicious, the women desolate, taking drams often, and often when they ought to buy food, and so horribly dirty and unthrifty that it is a common saying, you may know a factory girl as far as you can see her. So I leave you to judge, Miss Mary, whether such ladies as visit the cottages of the poor peasantry could have anything to say to such as these." Mary uttered no reply, but sat for many minutes with eyes steadfastly fixed upon the carpet. At length she raised them again to the face of her companion, and said, "It is then among such people as these that children, almost babies, for such is the one I have just seen, are often employed?" "Often, my dear? They are always employed with him. There's no particular hardship in that, you know, because these very men and women are the parents of the children, and so they could not be separated anyhow." "What a dreadful class of human beings, then, must these factory people form! Is it not considered as a great misfortune, Miss Tremlett, to the whole country?" "Why, as to that, my dear Miss Mary, there's many that will tell you that it is the finest thing in the world for these places where the great factories are established, because they give employment to so many thousands of men, women, and even the very smallest children that can stand, almost. But you must not ask me, my dear, what I think about that, for, of course, I am no fair judge at all. I, that spent my childhood playing amongst the harebells, raking up my little cocks of hay for the hardest work I was put to, and going to school to read, write, and sew, like the child of a decent Christian parents in a civilized country, I can hardly pass fair judgment on the going on so very different. But I have heard, my dear, for I believe these things are talked of more in the servant halls than among the great manufacturers themselves, especially when the ladies are by, I have heard that a great many of the learned gentlemen in a parliament say that the whole system is a blessing to the country. Then your account of it must be very false one, Miss Nurse Tremlett, said the young heiress severely. I only speak as much as I have heard, and a little that I have seen, replied the old woman meekly. However, my dear, dear Miss Brotherington, she added, if you will take an old servant's advice, who loves you very dearly, you will just make up your mind neither to talk nor to think any more upon the subject. I am quite sure that it will give you no pleasure, and it does not seem possible to me that you should do any good, for you know, my dear, that you have nothing at all to do with any of the factories now, any more than Lady Clarissa herself. Will you promise to take my advice, my dear, and think no more about it? On the contrary, Miss Tremlett, replied the young lady, I am perfectly determined that for some time to come I will think of nothing else. Mary Brotherton kept her word. During the whole time that Dowling Lodge theatricals were in preparation, while every other young heart in the neighbourhood, male or female, was eagerly anticipating the fete, hers was fixed steadfastly and immovably upon the mysterious subject that had seized upon it. That man was born to labour, that he was condemned to live by the sweat of his brow, she knew from high authority, and though under social compacts which civilization has led to, some portion of every race have found the means of performing the allotted task vicariously, she felt not called upon to say that the arrangement was a bad one. It was by no means difficult to conceive why it was so, nor why of necessity it must ever be so. She felt, as all must do who reflect on the subject, that if all distinctions were by some accident removed, and the entire organization of society begin de novo, each man standing precisely on the same level as his neighbor, the earth would not complete one revolution round the sun ere the equality would be violated. Strength will be the lord of imbecility. And when nature made one man more active and more intelligent or more powerful of frame than another, she made the law in which originated inequity of conditions, that, as time rolled on and mankind became bound together nation by nation, substituting the conventional distinctions of civilized society for those derived from individual strength, that when this happened, occasional anomalies should appear in the arrangement, seemed inevitable and of necessity be endured. That it was inevitable she conceived to be pretty nearly proved by the fact that no single authentic record makes mention of a nation in which hereditary distinction of some kind or other did not exist, nor did it seem desirable that when the prowess, the wit, the wisdom, or the toil of an individual had endowed him with wealth beyond his fellows, he should be denied the dear privilege of endowing with all the children he loved, instead of leaving it at his death to be struggled for, and borne away by the most crafty or the most strong. All this Mary Brotherton, in her little wisdom of 22 years and a half, could without difficulty reason upon and understand. But that among those whose fate or fortune had doomed to labour, some should be cherished, valued, and honoured by the masters who received and paid their industry, while other some were doomed, under the same compact of labour and payment, to the scorn, avoidance, and contempt of beings whose wealth and greatness proceeded from their toil, was an enigma she could in no wise comprehend. There must be something wrong, argued the young girl, as day by day she paced her gravel walks in solitary meditation. There must be something deeply, radically wrong in a system that leads to such results. I may perhaps be silly enough to look with something approaching envy at the noble who traces his 30 descendants unbroken from the venerable ancestors whose valor won in hard-fought field the distinction he still bears on his armorial coat. Yet when I look round upon what industry of my father, the only one of his race whose name I ever heard, when I contemplate what one man's industry can bequeath to his child, I feel that there is no very substantial cause for complaining of hereditary inferiority of condition. Nay, Were I one of the peasants of whom Lady Clarissa and Nurse Tremlett speak, I can well enough believe that I might live and die contented with a life of healthful and respected toil. But to exist in the condition of these outcast labourers, to be thrust out, as it were, beyond the pale that surrounds and protects society, to live like the wretch smitten by the witch's curse, a man forbid, must be hard to bear. Children, young creatures still wearing the stamp of heaven fresh upon their brows, are, as it seems, among the most these wretched ones. I will find out why this is so, or be worried to death by Sir Matthew Dowling and his fellow great ones in the attempt. Towards the end of the month which preceded the grand display expected at Dowling Lodge, Mr. Osmond Norval requested permission to submit his composition to Miss Brotherton's perusal, a compliment she graciously consented to receive, being desirous, before she witnessed its performance, of learning all she could respecting Sir Matthew's rather mysterious adoption of the factory boy, and also of the poor child's equally mysterious sufferings under the benevolent process that was performing on him. The little drama, therefore, which for obvious classical reasons the poet denominated a masque, reached her hands enveloped in delicately scented paper. But all she learned thereby was that Mr. Norval had thought proper to entitle it Gratitude and Goodness, or The Romance of Dowling Lodge, and to prelude it by a sonnet to be spoken by himself as prologue, in which a modest allusion was made to Milton's composition of Comus for the use of the Bridgewater family. She had, moreover, the gratification of discovering in what order Sir Matthew, Lady Clarissa, the poet, the governess, most of the young Dowlings, and little Michael himself were to appear upon the scene, and then she returned the young gentleman's manuscript with a very honest assurance that she doubted not that the composition would be most satisfactorily answer every purpose for which it was intended. Absurd as the whole business appeared to her, she resolved to be present at the representation, and having perceived, in her study of the exits and entrances, that no part was allotted to the homely Martha, she determined to place herself near her during the performance, in the hope of eliciting the information she was so anxious to obtain. On many occasions Miss Brotherton had remarked that this young lady either kept herself or was kept very much apart from the rest of the family, which circumstances had been quite sufficient to propitiate her kindness, for most cordially did Mary Brotherton dislike the whole Dowling race. But so deep-seated was the feeling of poor Martha herself that nobody did or could wish to converse with her, that the handshaking and smiles of the heiress had never suggested to her the idea that she might wish to be better acquainted. This shyness had hitherto effectually kept them apart, but no sooner did Mary perceive that the neglected girl was the only one of the family, above the age of a mere baby, to whom no part of Mr. Norval's drama was allotted, that she resolved to profit by the circumstance, and, if possible, to get from her such a commentary upon the piece as might enable her to comprehend its plot and underplot. Accordingly, when the great night of representation arrived, Miss Brotherton reached the lodge somewhat before the hour named in the invitation, and, finding, as she expected, the room where the company were to be received unoccupied, she desired one of the liveried attendants to send Miss Martha Dowling's maid to her. A female servant soon appeared. "Are you Miss Martha's maid?" said the young lady. "Oh, dear no, ma'am. I'm Miss Dowling's and Miss Harriet's maid. Miss Martha never wants a lady's maid at all, but I can take any message from you, ma'am, and that you may please to send." Miss Brotherton took one of her cards and wrote upon it with a pencil, "Dear Martha, if you're not going to act in the play, will you have the kindness to come to me?" This note the soubrette, as duty bound, first showed to her own young ladies. "Good gracious, how very odd! What can Miss Brotherton have to say to Martha? Martha, of all people in the world! She is not ill, Crompton, is she?" said Miss Arabella. No, dear ma'am. At least she didn't look so. She seemed to be in a great hurry, however, for me to take the card." Well, take it then," cried Miss Harriet, impatient, "and make haste, or I shall never get my ringlets done. They take such time. Do give her the card, Arabella. What good is there in spelling it over a dozen times? I say, I dare say she only wants to cross-question her about Augustus and what he's going to act. So take the card, Crompton, and run along with it to Martha as fast as you can." Crompton and the card found Martha sitting still undressed in the obscure little room allotted to her in the child's wing. She was deep in the pages of a new romance, and, being, if possible, more certain than usual that her presence would not be wanted, had made up her mind to enjoy herself till the time arrived for the commencement of the play, when it was her purpose to join the large party invited in the progress from the drawing-room to the theatre. On receiving Miss Brotherton's card, however, she hastily resumed the business of her toilet, for though the summons were as unintelligible to her as to her sisters, she felt, at least, an equal desire that it should be civilly complied with. It never took long to make poor Martha as smart as she ever thought necessary to be, and in a very few minutes she joined Miss Brotherton in the drawing-room.